So this discussion came out of a conversation between me and Jason where I suggested that we should reverse. Normally we look at our cybernetics principles and analyze society. And I suggested we reverse that for interest. This is not my area of expertise, but I'm hoping it will create a discussion. The idea was to say, if we are so keen on cybernetics, what sort of society would cybernetics create? What structure should we have? What would work if we assume that things aren't working? So there are two aims. One was to create a discussion in the forum, but my aim for this conversation is to actually say what I am going to try and do is to create a self-organizing, viable society that works in cohesion with the Earth's ecosystems so that people are enabling people to live meaningful lives. This is I don't think there's any mathematics in this conversation whatsoever. And it's a lot more opinionated. And so I'm very happy for people to interrupt me at any stage if you want to disagree with what I say. The first thing I argue, the first thing I would say is that when, this Troy is not true, but it makes a good story. When I'm walking on the South Downs, I come across, I get lost and I come across a farmer sitting on the fence and I say to him, could you tell me the way to Amberley? And he looks at me and he says, I can, but I wouldn't start from here. And I think for any change manager or anyone looking at changing the world, that's the universal problem, is where you are is where you are. And to get to where you want to go to, you have to start from here. So the first thing I wanted to do was to suggest from a cybernetic perspective, what the problems would be that we would see in the world. When we did this at the Metaphorium on the Metaphorium site with Angela Espinosa, this went round and round in circles for a long time. So I anticipate that you may well disagree. So I have labeled 3 problems with the current world, one of economic, one of political, and one of communications. I recognize first and foremost with the economic problems that capitalism has done an awful lot of good in the last 50 years and brought considerable billions of people out of poverty. But I argue that it's done so at the cost to world resources. It's also done so to create an environment of globalization that destroys value within groups and other values. It has brought almost everything down to a universal value assigned by money. Social values and other things, which I'll explain in a minute, seem to be getting bypassed. Globalization has also reduced our ability to form communities that enable us to create meaning in our lives. Part of the problem from the economic perspective, and particularly capitalism, is that the drive for efficiency over effectiveness has left people's well-being out of the question. In my research, rarely came across people in business who would describe themselves as happy. In fact, in some places I went into, there was open hostility. More to the point, coming back to a cybernetic perspective, the drive for efficiency at the cost of effectiveness has reduced our world's ability to adapt and cope with state changes. Pandemic being the biggest example, but I suspect if global warming is now here to stay, that we have lost our ability to effectively change and have diverse subsystems because we have created one system around the world. Some of this was based on a lot of myths about free trade and the constant need for free trade based on concepts in economics, which have left people sidelined. Secondly, moving on to political, I've said this before, voting systems which appear to be there to solve problems actually create their own problems. They create their own environment. A first past the post voting system in almost every country will create a division between liberals and conservatives, those who want change and those who want things to stay as they are. There's also those who don't want anything to stay as it is and don't want any change, who we call anarchists. But there's another group of people. Recently, a very good book came out by Karen Stenner on authoritarians, who exist both with liberals and conservatives. And whereas conservatives are people who don't want change in a time dimension, authoritarians are people who don't want it in a space dimension. They want everybody to be the same. And these people, from her research, make up about a third to a quarter of the population in most countries. And one of the arguments that she comes across says is that liberal democracy, which has embraced complexity, frightens authoritarians, and so it has created its own problems. And I think if we look at areas like the tragedy of the commons and common sense morality, which are spelled out very well by Joshua Green, we have large areas of the world which really are common land or common seas that should be shared. And we have no real method of sharing those sensibly. It's still a free-for-all. And that goes back to this business about capitalism using up the world's resources. The common sense morality comes from moral frameworks. So people that we have no system, again, of bringing the world into one common moral framework that enables them to decide how to resolve the tragedy of the commons. And we also have no, and the best example I can give is the story of Easter Island, which if you want to know if man will chop down the last tree, the evidence is that he will do that. Easter Island was inhabited, first of all, by Polynesians in 1250, and it was covered in pine forests, which they used for everything from boats to building shelters and everything. And in about 1800, they chopped down the last tree, and their lives subsequently changed. They had to live in caves. They could no longer build boats to go fishing. Their considerable infighting started because they had no means of resolving the tragedy of the commons. Lastly, the means that we have of trying to bring everybody together, which is the media, has become a system of tribal truths and generation of outrage. And I'll come to explain those from social identity theory. The main aim of the press is to simplify things and to sensationalize, and to create a sense of outrage amongst its readership group, which is classic in-group behavior. It says, I'm one of you. Balanced reporting, even by people like the BBC, is no longer balanced. They desperately look, it depends what you mean by balance. So they desperately look, if they have one opinion, for anybody who's got the opposite opinion, even if it's one individual who's not recognized. That problem of how do you balance and everything, I believe needs to be resolved by a constitution of knowledge. This was a recent book by Jonathan Rauch, who I think provides a solution to a lot of those problems. And he basically shows the difference between, say, Wikipedia and Facebook. And he says, before we can even start to solve the tragedy of the commons or areas like this, or many of our social problems, we need a constitution of knowledge that allows us to accept what is truth. He proposes two rules, the fabulist rule and the empirical rule. The fabulist rule is really another form of the demarcation problem. No one gets, I mean, these might go, Jason may like these for the club of Remy. No one gets the final say. You may claim that a statement is established, only if it can be debunked, and only if it can be debunked. There are problems, and Jonathan Rauch recognizes there are problems with the demarcation problem. And I've given a person who's done a lot of work recently there, Massimo Bigliucci, I can't say Bigliucci, and there are problems with Popper's definition, but what he argues is the behavior that it causes you to try to prove that what you're saying is not some pseudoscience, it is based on something, allows it to be debunked, and so your behaviors are more constitutional. If you, the second rule then is the empirical rule, is that no one can claim a personal authority, and that you can't claim that you have some inherent right to the truth. That system that we need to establish before, in almost any way, we can actually get people to accept a standard of truth. So looking at my original statement, I used the word self-organizing, and I'd like to just make sure we explain that. And I'd like to explain that by asking you a problem, which I think is quite a useful way that I used to do in some of the lectures I did. People sometimes think self-organizing means a sort of free-for-all and it'll sort itself out. The problem I used to give people is to say that the police go on strike and there's no traffic police anymore. How would you try to get the roads to be self-organizing, drivers to be self-organizing? The best answer I ever had came from a student who said, what I would do is put a camera in everyone's car with 3 buttons on it. One says speeding, one says driving dangerously, and one said stupid or something like that. I can't remember what the other one was. But when someone went screaming past you at fast speed, you pressed the button and it recorded his name and his number and sent his number into a central place. Now, if several people did that and corroborated you, you scored reputational points, and he lost reputational points. If you were someone who kept pressing the button and weren't corroborated, you would lose points. And essentially what this student had said was that one of the best ways of self-organizing in a human system is through reputation. What he then went on to explain was really, he got carried away with his system, but what was quite good was that he said, we don't then have to have definitions of 70 miles an hour is speeding or not. It could be, I think you're speeding in relation to the system can then be adaptive, because you could have a button that says speeding in relation to the road conditions, so that the local people could then set parameters of what they felt was safe. So that's a very simple description of what I'm trying to give, but there needs to be some sort of heuristic that allows people to self-organize. So going to the viable systems model, I would suggest that one of the key things that we need in society, first and foremost, are autonomous subsystems, which is one of the things Stafford Beer said is the most important. Now, I'll deviate slightly. In the model I'm suggesting, the Earth is not the environment. The Earth is a codependent subsystem. If we can't continue to look on the Earth as though it's a heat sink for everything, the environment is the whole of society, and Earth, or the whole of our world, if you want to put it that way, and the subsystem is the environment which is codependent on our society. When I try to look at putting things like politics, economics, legal and social in as subsystems, it doesn't work. Subsystems seem to have to be communities, towns, and the politics and the economics and legal become part of the cohesion that we need for society. Cooperatives and associations need to be managed by this concept of the constitution of knowledge. I'll come back to that. And one of the issues that I always have is that if you look at the viable systems model, one of the problems we tend to have in organization society is that people get into parts of the model. There's people who sit in system 2, there's people who sit in systems 3, the operations manager, there's people who sit in systems 4, and there's the director who sits in system 5. Those people turn themselves into elites and look after their own self-interest. So for me, coming back to Ackoff, the only way I think that we can do that is if the meta system is provided by the cooperation of the groups, much in line with Ackoff's participatory management. I'll mention three things here. Much of the change to create autonomous communities is already with us. A project called Living Streets, which moved all the cars out of streets, soon found that people reclaimed the streets. We found children playing in the streets where they were safe. People came out and sat in the streets and talked to it. Almost instantly created a community. The second project that I think is worth looking at is the Fife Diet Project, which was a project started in Fife in Scotland, where a group of people just started eating local produce and refusing to eat stuff in supermarkets that had been brought in from outside. And very quickly, it made a significant change to the area of Fife. It created a lot of local jobs, a lot of meaning, and it was emphasizing the point that much of our globalization of our world is transporting stuff around the world at a great cost to our societies. Technology coming online will enable, so one of the things I'm trying to argue is that creating autonomous communities isn't about going back to some glorified past where we had little towns and it was lovely and everybody knew everybody else. It's about using some modern technologies to remove centralization of command, sewage systems, water systems. As you start to create an autonomous house, an autonomous street, an autonomous town, so you free up the obligations and the vertical variety that is tying people to larger systems and reducing their meaning in their lives or the ability to adapt. Moving on, I'll cover cohesion by saying that economics, legal, social, and moral values, these values are dependent on the normative areas, and I think I've shown this before. But if we look at this small grid of normative relations, and we look at, say, intimate, and that intimate relations can be both at a societal level, a group level, or a personal level. At the personal level, we would understand things like love and courtship and nurturing. The normative areas have could be as many as you wish to describe, close, social, or business. But it tends to be that the norms of behavior in these areas, in these boxes, don't mix well with other areas. So for instance, business behavior and values in business do not work well when they're mixed with personal levels. So love and courtship and business is called prostitution. It doesn't go down well in society. So one of the things that's very interesting, if we go back again to one of my favorite subjects, the Quakers in 1640, they brought social behavior into business. If you did business, they revolutionized business in the 1640s by introducing a novel concept called integrity. If you shook a hand, if you did business agreement with a Quaker, he would not cheat on you at all. And soon everybody wanted to do business with Quakers, which is where the big Quaker firms came from. So bringing cohesion into some of these is quite important in the normative relationships, but also recognizing where they don't mix is also important. So the cohesion that we need to create a more viable world needs to recognize that there are different normative areas. And overall, those cohesions have to come to a total coherence, which is a meaningful life for people. I'll come to what a meaningful life is in a minute. I've used the word reputation as being an important aspect of humans' definition of self-organization. I've got a little story to tell about National Health Service administrators, which I think is important at this level. So several years back, the doctors in the National Health Service decided that they had too much work on, and they brought in people who they called administrators. And I'm being very open in my description here, so I can understand that. However, those administrators made themselves managers and took control of the National Health Service. And now every doctor you talk to will grumble that he's managed by people who don't understand medicine. And my argument to them is, well, you gave up that by bringing in people to manage it for you. And this is why I argue that it's really important to have participatory design with no elites in the meta system. Viability requires anticipation, and it's really important. One of the problems with globalization and capitalism, it has brought us to anticipate only one possible future. It's really important in any system to create visions of all possible futures, and to make sure your system is adaptable to meet those. That means that you essentially are inefficient but effective. And that goes back to Ackoff's laws of subsystems independence, where he says, you know, if you tune the system for the subsystems for efficiency, you detune the whole system. Adaptability, if we create one global system, then and lose diversity in towns, in the way we do things, in ways on, we lose our ability to adapt. Particularly if that one global system we have is centralized through centralized systems. And despite the fact that sorry, I keep pressing the wrong button. Despite the fact that we know we shouldn't have monopolies, yet they predominate everywhere. I read an interesting article recently to say that actually most of the food in America is actually provided by 5 mega corporations. They might have different names on their products, but there's 5 corporations producing most of the. And so despite everything we know about monopolies, we still allow them to exist. Lastly, system 5, the ideals, really needs heuristics. We can't manage the world through rules, going back to Wittgenstein's problem of family resemblance. The only way I think you can really manage this system is through heuristics. Reputation, well-being of the world and people, and recursivity, remembering that recursivity, that the ideals must be embedded in all subsystems. And lastly, the press needs to provide an algedonic signal, which is a process of gossip, but that's how communities work. So lastly, I've only got 2 more slides. I'm not going to go through this slide in detail, but begs a question in my title is, what is a meaningful life? I have a simple definition that happiness is the byproduct of undertaking a worthwhile activity. There is an awful lot of evidence in psychology and in business research to show that a higher meaning in life and a purpose in life is associated with better physical health, reduced mortality, and that living a meaningful life is one of several enduring pathways to happiness. In social identity theory, which I find can be fitted close to the principles in cybernetics, such as categorization, recursion, is the best model of human behavior. Self-esteem becomes one of the most important factors that humans use when they form groups. They self-categorize, look around them, and join groups which they think are going to improve their self-esteem and their protection. When I did research on this, I found that it's a fairly obvious answer. that although people want to join a group because they have affinity with that group as they categorize it as all being the same, nevertheless, they want to be recognized in their group for being unique and of value. So it's a sort of group paradox. But at the same time, they also want their group to have prestige amongst other groups. What humans tend to do is social mobility. If you see a group that you think is better than your group or has higher values of dimension, a higher value in a dimension that's important to you, you will move to that group. If you're stopped from moving to that group, you do one of two things. So if you want to join the rich kids in the playground, but they won't let you, you might form a group where you recategorize and say, well, look, they're rich, but we're happy, or we're kind. You might recategorize on something that gives you meaning. Or you might engage in social conflict and start stealing their lunchtime sandwiches or something. So social exclusion results in a perceived loss of meaningfulness in life. So part of the problem we have is that if you create exclusive groups, you are almost certainly going to create social conflict. I relate a lot to, unlike logotherapy, Viktor Frankl and his man's search for meaning. He puts value as well into three areas: creative, experiential, and attitudinal. And one of the things that I'm finding that's interesting, and one of the things I was talking about when I talked about the commons, is we are seeing areas like software which have become common property, using a thing called a GPL license, or several other licenses, where you have to question why are people writing Python for free and distributing it for free. And it's partly because reputation is so important to people. But what a lot of people have done is to make ideas, instead of patenting stuff, they're making ideas open to the public as long as they are recognized as the originator of it. So we're creating a sort of commons with intellectual knowledge. And I think that's fairly important. And it comes back to this business of needing to recognize people for their creativity. I'll summarize very quickly. Autonomous, self-organized communities that create well-being are vital. And those have been subverted. Sorry, I didn't explain that very well. Globalization is basically removing some of these areas where people find value. So the very simplest one is, within a small group, it's quite easy to have value by being important to that group in some way. Once that group becomes worldwide, you enter the cult of celebrity. In order to get value, you have to do something more and more extreme. So self-organizing communities are vital, that people can achieve value. Use technology to overcome some of the centralization problems that we have. The political and economic systems that are coherent with moral frameworks and value viable effectiveness over efficiency. We need to create a culture of a constitution of knowledge to determine what is true, to be able to overcome the problem of common sense morality. We need to develop mechanisms of government that allow cooperative participatory design and the elimination of elites. And we need to introduce, like eBay, reputation management into the structure of our society. And that's me.
Questions?
I have a procedural question. Jason, I have also questions for Jonathan, but Jason, my understanding was that last time you hadn't given your presentation and you were going to give it today. But then
I don't mind because it's always an attractive point. You guys want to hear what I'm going to say.
no, but yeah, because there may again be not enough time for your presentation, and then you're going to say we need to wait another month or maybe another 3 months
Too
to
much,
hear
too
your
much.
presentation.
If you missed me today, you will have to meet me at October because September is already scheduled. But no problem, because if we do have more topics, we can schedule bi-weekly instead of monthly.
All right.
George.
Jason.
Oh, well, Jamie, I think Jamie said she had another question for Jonathan.
I'll wait till you guys have asked questions. Raoul is also wanting to ask a question, I guess.
I am. It's a very simple question, Jonathan. How do you relate, just trying to explain to me so that I understand, self-organization, viable systems, and happiness? Can you put the three together into one particular discourse?
Yeah, I've glossed over that, but so my research work was basically on looking at the viable system of understanding if social groups could be viable systems. And so what I did was look at putting, I looked in psychology for theories, and the only one I found that really looked at groups, because most psychology looks at the individual. So except for social identity theory, which tends to look at group behavior, and social cognition, which looks at the individual behavior, and they are recursive, if you want to put it that way. So one of the key things with social identity theory was that a lot of our esteem comes from our associations and our relationships. So to put that together, we form groups which in some cases, not always, can become viable systems, viable social systems. And from that, it's our behavior within that that gives us a lot of meaning in our lives.
So can you just help me? Social systems are the same as viable systems?
No, not necessarily. A social system, a social group might be a viable group if it has those key issues of the viable system, which I think you're more of an expert than me. But you may well have a social group that is not viable, it is not going to survive.
Yeah, and so the general purpose of your presentation today is to discuss self-organization, viability, and
well, the self-organization comes from, so what is the most basic group that you can have to form your viable society? And for me, it must be some form of community. Now, you could have associations where we spread people with like interests across the nation. But for me, it makes a lot. I come back to this argument that we are not paying for transport. So for me, you need to create viable communities is the lowest level. So you could start with a family unit, and then you could start with a street, or you could start with a town. But that town needs to be an autonomous system. And so therefore, I argue it needs to be self-organizing.
And how does recursion comes into this?
So at what level? So then we have communities of communities, I presume. So you're talking about we have towns and we make up an area. And that area has to have some, those towns in that area then have to have some form of cohesion, and you get the level of recursion coming on.
Yes, and basically trying to work out a general framework from your talk today, and I'm finding it difficult.
Okay, so the problem we have at what I'm basically arguing at the moment is that when I drive to work, or when I used to drive to work, I would go into Portsmouth 50 miles away or 30 miles away, and half of Portsmouth would drive down here to Chichester because they have work here. Half the goods, so to actually say that I'm a community here that's self-organizing and self-producing and self-supplying and autonomous is not true. I'll give you a good example. Tomorrow I get a delivery of tomatoes from a local supplier, and they smell wonderful. If I go to Waitrose down the street and buy tomatoes, there's no smell to them because they've been distributed over 3 or 4 days across the country. There's a global distribution system. The Fife project, the Fife Diet project, looked at making Fife an autonomous system that was able to stand on its own.
So what I am understanding now is that you are recognizing that self-organization, viability, and social performance are connected, and that they need to bring together some degree of happiness to those of us who are part of those social groups. Is there anything in any way that you connect all these things with ideas of requisite variety or the ideas of relationships that, as you know, I am very much interested in?
Yes, I think if you push down the management of people, so one of the questions I brought up there was the lack of, the need to get rid of centralization of control. And create more diverse local communities, because that allows requisite variety. I can cope with, I can grow the stuff I need to for my population. So one of the problems at the moment, just take for instance, stuff that is manufactured in China and brought all the way to England in a container, and they've produced, I don't know, thousands of coffee cup holders. Now, I don't know if I want a coffee cup holder, so to decide if I need a coffee cup holder, they advertise and they convince me I need to buy a coffee cup holder. But the amount of waste in this system, if I need a coffee cup holder, why can't I go down to the local 3D printer shop and print one out? Why does it need a container ship, a container, movement across the world, a factory in China to produce something that I didn't even know I wanted before I knew it? So the global requirement for efficiency has actually created tremendous waste.
And how do you handle the problem of relationships in general? Because what you're talking about is something about efficiency there.
Relationships between what?
Between, you mentioned that anticipation was one of the essential aspects of a viable system. And I'm just wondering whether it is anticipation in the sense of a model, or is it a relationship with an environment that is stretching us in terms of what we can do or what we need to do, or challenging us in one form or another, and it is from there that we are moving ahead into the future, rather than by producing models as you were suggesting.
So Dan Gilbert's work on happiness and human behavior at social psychology in Harvard, he did some interesting work, and it was very simple. He asked people what their life had been like over the last 5 years. Was there significant change? And the answer, most people came back and said, yeah, oh God, it was awful. I got made redundant. I did this. And then he asked them how they foresaw their life in the next 5 years. And they did not anticipate much change. And the simple conclusion he came up to is that people are incredibly bad at anticipating what is going to happen. And basically he said it's because our memories are better than our imaginations. There are few groups that I did work on who actually looked down to try and anticipate what was going to happen to them. And those that did created a strategy for the future, looked at one possible future instead of the likelihood of the multiple futures that could happen. So they weren't ready for things when they happened. So part of viability, particularly in the times that I think are coming up, is to anticipate. I mean, you only have to look at our inability to anticipate a pandemic and be ready for a pandemic. The pandemic also came about because of a lack of local control. I had an outbreak back in March, in 2020, one of the first outbreaks going in the UK, and I responded to it very, very quickly at a local level, doing all the things that needed to be done, like separating people into groups, putting them into different areas. And I kept the business running, even though there was an outbreak, and we controlled the outbreak and reduced it. It seemed to me that much of the outbreak of the pandemic has only been able to be managed through centralized orders, whereas much of the country could have been kept running if locally people organized themselves and managed the requisite variety.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan.
George.
Yeah. First of all, Jonathan, great. I posted in the chat the fact that at the last ISSS conference, we had a special track, a 4-day track on this subject, precisely looking to the future, trying to figure out what the course of the human social system might be. Any of you who are members of the ISSS will be able to get access to the recordings of that in a few weeks or a month or so. And basically, Jonathan, what I wanted to do is invite you to join our group. We have a small community. Our main thesis is that we look at the history of what I've called ontogenesis, the way the world has become more complex, the universe has become more complex over time, try to discern the patterns of complexification and then use that to sort of project forward what might happen to bring about I would call it a unified, not a centralized, but a unified human social system as a subsystem of the Earth as a whole. So if you're at all interested, we should exchange emails and I can fill you in more about what went on there.
Absolutely delighted, George. Yep.
Jamie.
Great.
Hi.
Hi, Jamie.
Hello. I think I have 3 comments. Maybe the first is a general one. In the United States, and I don't know how it's going on in Europe because I'm in the United States, I used to teach strategic management. And that was a capstone course at the 4th year. And there are a gazillion of textbooks now, thanks to the publishing industry, that all explain strategic management. And one of the key elements in strategic management is that you do like scenario development. So you imagine like 4, 5, 6 different possible. Yeah. So then you have also the analysis of the environment according to 6 dimensions. So you try to imagine every possible trend classified according to the 6 dimension. And then you develop a strategic plan. So that was what I was teaching my students. So I'm just pointing this out because this thinking about the future has been going on at least since 1976 when a strategic management journal was founded. and the Strategic Management Society was developed. So
I didn't find, Jamie, many firms that did that. They knew about it, but they don't do it.
Yeah, no, that is because you, I'm sorry, I don't know how else. I wish I had the gift of Raoul, who just asked questions to make you think. But I was surprised by all the things that you're not covering. So what I'm seeing is you developed an explanation that was satisfactory to you to solve the problem. And then you were telling all of us what we needed to do, and then the problem would be solved. But the one thing that was really missing is what is the role of educational systems? And that brings me back to why are I here in the cybernetic community? That is because one day some guy told me, you're doing exactly what you're accusing the others of doing. So he was actually pointing out the little feedback loop that I was trying to solve the problem. And by the way, there was a management presentation in the Netherlands, in Rotterdam. And the guy who said that to me was someone from Denmark. So it was a little international context. So he told to me, so you think you're solving the problem, but actually you're contributing it by the structure of your argument and by the way you set up the engagement. And somehow that stuck to me. And so then I started thinking, and instead of saying, oh, all the others are the problem, I started thinking, how, in which extent are I, Margaret Hendricks, part of the problem in the way that I'm interacting with the system? And so this is the reason I'm here in cybernetics, because I think we're all interested in understanding how are we personally, individually, right here, right now, part of the system or the solution. And I think that Margaret Mead, people can complain about that she was not scientific enough, but she and her husband or ex-husband, they kind of set up a really good starting point. We need to look at the family system and what happens just when humans come into the world and how they evolve and interact. So, Jonathan, I didn't see anything about that either. In your presentation, I saw you complaining, I saw you accusing a few people of being part of the problem. And then there was this solution, if everyone just would listen to us, the technocrats who know better. And I think
the only, I think I'd need to be, I'd come back at you slightly, Jamie. I really don't intend to accuse anybody. And I started off by saying capitalism has a lot of problems, but it's also brought large numbers of people out of poverty. So, and one of the things I tried to do in the SIS is to say that, so in that slide, I'm not sure if it's still coming up, creating the environment to change, recognizing the problems. I'm not accusing the conservatives or the liberals. What I'm trying to say is these people are there whether you like it or not. We could put ourselves into any of those categories. One of the problems with our political systems is it ignores those categories, and I talked about Karen Stenner's book about the authoritarian dynamic is really interesting because these people are not going to go away, and
people. That's a sort of language. These people.
Okay. So this definition. I mean, I could well be one of these people. Very happy if you're saying I'm an authoritarian.
No, I mean it's the narrative.
All right, let me put it another way. These categories of people will not go away. They are inherent in our social structures. There is some evidence to say it is genetic, that people have a predisposition to certain viewpoints. Okay. So conservatives and authoritarians you can be a liberal and an authoritarian.
So here I would like to interrupt if I may, because we have the educational system, but then we also have the scientific community. Because here you just took as a fact that whatever the scientific community did, that it was called the absolute truth or whatever you want to call it, that it is genetic. that there are the authoritarians, and you. What I don't see again is on the dynamic interaction, how we're all creating a structure in which we submit, and now we complain. And you actually, Jonathan, I want to give you credit for. I mean, not that it's up to me, but you made a lot of good points. But by the fact that you didn't talk about human development and specifically the context of the schools, the family, the university, the researchers, how they're saying this is the truth and you must listen to me or the world will explode. And that we have this entire dynamic, and that dynamic is the problem. It's not all those individual categories, but how we're interacting with each other. And okay, I'll rest my case now.
No, that's exactly, I think that puts exactly what I was trying to say, is it is the dynamic of how different groups are going together. And I didn't have much time, but if the very good book by Joshua Green and Jonathan Hyatt Jonathan Hyatt produced one on the righteous mind, and Joshua Green on moral tribes. None of them can come up with a solution of how we get these dynamics work together. But I do believe that Jonathan Rauch's book on the constitutional knowledge, it's a very good book. And what I was trying to do was to point people at books. I didn't have enough time to talk about the education system as well, but you're right, the education, if you put in economic, political, educational system, I think, yes, you're right. And that I wanted to engender, if you go back to that, I wanted to create a discussion. I'm very happy to be wrong. And I would agree with you, education becomes one of the key subsystems that needs to, where there is a dynamic, where what we are educating people and how we are educating them is really important.
Jonathan, may I add a question here? Yeah, I just a quick question and then class. My question is, how would you connect your ideas with the existing societies that are under communist too? China.
So you're very muted. You're very muted, Jason.
Huh?
You're very muted.
How about now?
Yeah, that's better.
Yeah, my question is, how would you connect your presentation today with the existing societies that are ruined by heavy ideology, communism, Islamic ideology, and that sort of societies? What will be the big gap between your ideal society, feasible, viable society, with those existing ones? China, North Korea, Iran, just name a few.
So authoritarian, so right, so Karen Stenner, who is has researched authoritarians closely for a while using social identity theory, says the basic viewpoint of someone who has a predominance to authoritarianism is they have a lack of openness in the the Big Five personality test. They tend to be people who want the world to be very ordered and structured. And they want everybody to be in a similar way. And so one of those problems with authoritarian regimes is that you have to, that they are almost a reaction to the complexity of the world. And you saw this with some of Trump supporters, wanting the world to be simplified, straightforward. It's how we say it is, and we're all going to be the same. We're all going to wear the same gear. It became almost a religious cult. The way Karen Stenner talks about dealing with those people within a community is to be very, to have to sit down and to allay their fears. You cannot ignore them. You must talk through with them what they are worried about. And actually you have to go and meet them halfway by simplifying the world. You cannot keep telling them that they must do this. They must be liberal, they must be this. So she talks very interestingly about how you have different groups of people and you have to accept that those people are different and you have to work out how you have to allay their fears. How you deal with an authoritarian regime, which is what I think you're talking about, Jason, is much more complicated because that's to do with power. And that's often to do with someone who has, I would argue, is very strongly on the sociopathic continuum at one end. You're dealing with a narcissistic sociopath in many cases who there is nothing you're going to do or say which is going to allow him to give up power. The only way you can ever deal with that is through cooperation in the world and getting communities in the world to create a community that pressures people. And that's, I don't like that word. Trying to find a word to say. People tend to want to belong to the group, and that's one way of getting people to form a group. If you form a group that is successful and doing well, people will want to join it.
Let me update you the latest news coming from China this week. They are now cracking down the whole tutoring industry. Those companies, private operations that offer young kids some tutoring services and training, sort of subsiding the education system when the authoritarian education system is not working well. Now they are cracking down all of them. That means the CCP is making a big move to prepare all the youngsters in China ready to war. So in this kind of reality, how could we, well, make use of your theory?
So I think, Jason, that's a good question, because I would look at, so my preference would be for the Joe Biden approach rather than the Donald Trump approach. The Donald Trump approach was antagonistic. Joe Biden has sought to get cooperation of all the states around China and to basically say to people, this behavior isn't acceptable. We as a group don't see it as acceptable. And I think it'll be interesting to see, I don't know, but I feel that the second option has a better way of creating change and coherence than the first.
Klaus, you have a question.
May I ask a question? Or rather, first, I would like to congratulate you for one important thing that I have been always insisting on, namely, you recognize individuals as having a basic role in the construction of social systems. Most system scientists simply talk about viable systems and everyone else is subservient to it. I think that is the most important contribution that I hear today. But there are a few points that I would like to ask you to reflect on it. One is you talk about knowledge. Well, knowledge seems to be such a stationary thing, and there's always related to truth. But if you change it towards projects, if you think, for example, you mentioned Viktor Frankl. I am also a fan of his, and he didn't deal with meaningful knowledge rather than meaningful projects. As you remember, he was in the concentration camp, and he found out that those people who survived had a project. They wanted to write a poetry or direct something. So that there is the future action is more important than simply knowledge. And that deals also with the issue of, you make the statement that capitalism has its positive elements, eliminating poverty. But poverty is mentioned in terms of, is measured in terms of money. So it's the currency that everyone accepts. And that is, I think, it's really doubtful. And they're coming back to Viktor Frankl, I don't think money ought to be the universal criteria for everything. So I think to me, it's important to go back to the individuals. And I think the notion of a meaningful life is, I think, important, but it's also important to have meaningful actions in the future. That's my main suggestion. But I really appreciate it, and I hope that we get the slides, and I will probably lead this Karen's Stenner's paper, which I have not seen. I hope you sent that around, the references, and I'm very pleased with it, and it gave me a lot of good ideas.
Thank you, Klaus. I think I agree with you 100%, and I rushed through it, so I didn't really get a time. But if I go to that slide, what is a meaningful life? Underneath it, I put happiness is the byproduct of undertaking a worthwhile activity.
Yeah, there it is in India, but then
and so I fully agree with you 100%. I think, yes, doing something that is worthwhile. And what I always say to people is not something you enjoy, something that you think is worthwhile, that has meaning, that creates meaning. And also the second point you made about money, I think I tried to make that point a lot, to say that there are different values in life. I'll get there eventually. Nurturing has a value. In those different social modes, they have values. But my great worry is that money is being brought into all of those and demeaning their actual value in their mode of operation. And there is only one country at the moment that doesn't use GDP. I've got it in here somewhere, I'm looking for it quickly. I think it is only Bhutan that refuses to use GDP and uses a well-being index. And so one of the things I've got in there, some notes, somewhere in the notes there, it says that we should get rid of GDP and have a well-being index for the world, based on people's levels of, you can't measure happiness easily, but you can measure well-being.
Yeah. But I think, again, well-being has kind of a very stationary feeling. And I mean, the meaningful or worthwhile activity, that needs to be measured.
Yes. How do we,
let me also say, you know, I forgot now the name. Anyway, about undermining authoritarianism, and including authority, means actually finding something that is, Gene Sharp is the one that I wanted to mention. He had a manual basically of how to overcome dictatorships. And one of the things is that all authoritarian systems, first of all, authoritarian systems require subordination. So one should not focus so much on the authority, but also on the subordination. But if one wants to overcome authoritarianism, one has to find a way that is bypassing the strength of the authorization. That means money. If you want to make a revolution, you don't accumulate more money. You undermine the system that has other weaknesses. And I think that is, to me, very important, to not have a uniform criteria, whether that is well-being or whether that is money. There must be something else.
Yeah, and I think also in the structure of society that you create. So if I go back to that conversation I was having with Raoul, if you create small autonomous communities, which are self-sustaining and self-supporting, it gets much harder for, if there's no centralized command, it's much harder for a dictator to get hold of mechanisms that are going to control all of those systems. I don't know if Raoul would agree with that, but for me, that is...
Jonathan, I think what I've been thinking through Klaus's comments is that somehow the language that you have used in your presentation, somehow it reinforces a kind of hierarchical language, though I am quite clear that you are not. But one of the things that seems to me important is to spend more time about creating spaces and the implications of creating spaces for people to develop their own experience, their own knowledge, and construct from there something that is valuable. So is that bottom-up language that I think I was missing in the language that you were using, which was somehow top-down, and though I know you didn't intend to do that, but it came to me in that way. And Jason's question to you somehow was making that apparent with the situation in China.
Yes, I think that reinforces Jamie's comments.
And if I may, since you mentioned my name, instead of bottom up, why not just say horizontal, and that we recognize it's in ourselves, it's in my head, the structure of looking up for a God the Father or God the leader of the CCP. And if I stop thinking that I need to look up, but if I look left and right, then I may able to eventually really listen, and that's my emphasis on discursive processes. And when I listen, then I will hear that my neighbor is actually not my enemy or not a Trump supporter, or not a follower brainwashed by the CCP, but is actually someone who is equally concerned and equally interested in solving these problems. Now, Jonathan, I also discovered, I was thinking like Raoul was doing, I think I now understand a little better what I'm concerned with, the dimensions and the paradox and how to solve the paradox. I think it is that people are going one level up to solve the paradox, while I think is they need to go one level down to solve the paradox. And actually, they don't even need to move levels. They can stay on the same level, because that is a way that deductive logic is presented, is that you give an argument and you state your assumptions, and then you argue that it's a good argument. And then I look at it and I say, yeah, but did you think about this assumption? And did you think about that assumption? And then you respond to my argument. And so we move forward. So like what we were doing right now, we were not saying, oh, there is a circular paradox and we're running around in circles and we need to go a level up. But I was just saying, did you think about the educational system? And then you responded to me something. And so we didn't go a level up. We just talked as humans. And so anyway, thank you for your presentation. Yeah.
Thank you, Jamie.
Could I ask
Very
a question?
good. Yes, Jerry, go ahead.
Okay, Jonathan, first of all, I really enjoyed your presentation, and I learned some things that I can apply here in my local community and in my own community building activities. So congratulations on a good talk, yeah. Nevertheless, I think there's substantial deficiencies, and the one I would like to bring out is the one that Jason brought up. My first thought was that, Jonathan, you are very, very British. And then I thought, well, yeah, this is probably true for Western Europe and much of the United States. But when you go to other cultures, I think you have run into needs for a different vocabulary, a different description of how things might unfold. And in this context, I would suggest a research project for you. And this research project this is off the top of my head. Don't, take it or leave it, or whatever you want to do with it. But first is to create a dictionary of the necessary terms for the implementation of a strategic management plan to bring about the changes that you wish. Second would be then create another dictionary for other cultures that are not Western European. And what terminology difference would you need to inject into your style of creating, shall we say, a more just society?
Thanks, Jerry, because you're spot on. Because when I used to do change management, I did all the thinking and I gave the selling to people. So I used social identity theory and I used a gossip system. So so Jamie may find this interesting. What I did was I took a group of psychologists around with me, and they said, nobody's listening to you, because at the time I was a high-ranking person, and they said they're very grateful that someone high, but he doesn't talk. You don't talk their language, which is exactly what you're saying. So what social identity says, social identity theory says that you trust people in your in-group much more than you trust people in your out-group. You believe people in your in-group. So what I would always do if I was trying to implement something was to get a team that's as diverse as possible of all the different countries that I'm going to talk to. And I would spend a lot of time trying to convince them of my good intention and what the principles were. And I would get them to sell it to their own people, because you never trust somebody, you never like the first thing you said is, I'm very British. That immediately, I don't know if you noticed, but if you ever watch an American film, Jerry, the bad guy is always British.
Always German.
So
I
would
007?
So you look at any American film, always the bad guy is always British, because they need someone who looks differently and speaks differently, you see, but he needs to speak English. So he's always from another country. And that's part of this issue of social identity. The second thing I always do with change management is to understand what the role of gossip is. And gossip is the algedonic signal in a social group. So gossip is really interesting. You don't get out of bed and gossip about what you had for breakfast. You gossip about what is breaking the normative behavior in your social group. Who's doing what, or who's not doing what, or who's breaking the rules is what you gossip about. And also that gossip travels faster than any email. It goes around your organization like a rocket, or it goes across the world like a rocket. The press has basically become the gossip system of the world. So if you want to make sure that you get the right information out to people, I always look for what I call connectors, people who talk a lot to other people because of the position in their organization or whatever. And I always made sure that they were told straight away the latest information, because then I knew it would be transmitted quickly, strategically around an organization, and I would beat the misinformation that would be sent by different tribal groups trying to subvert the message. So, but what you said, Jerry, is absolutely spot on. I am not the person to sell something.
Well, let me follow up with Jerry's suggestion. Maybe we can do a little project to do a little vocabulary thing, as Jerry suggested. Jonathan, you do a British one, and I can do a Chinese one, and we don't have a Muslim friend here, so we will invite Carl to give us a Muslim one. Maybe the vocabulary can be only, like say, 100 words, or just 10 words. 10 very, very important concepts that other cultures are not understanding good enough. How about we do something like that?
if I go back, Jason, to what I started with, what were my aims? It was to create a discussion. And that discussion essentially is that a statement, self-organization, viable society that works in cohesion with the Earth's ecosystem, providing people to live meaningful, enabling people to live meaningful lives. So my purpose of this conversation was to see if I could get people to sign up to that statement, or if not, to knock it down and replace it with something they saw as better.
In follow-up to
in order to
Jason's,
do the discussion, you have to have a vocabulary first.
yeah, Jason, in follow-up to your comment, I think if one wishes to do such a project, which I perhaps could contribute to, then I think you need a skeleton of terms to which initiates the dictionary. And if Jonathan could put together such a skeleton, it would then provide the springboard for strategic additions and deletions from that skeleton.
Yeah, why not? From a change management point of view, what are the key concepts that?
But I think Lucio should participate in this project because he's thought very deeply about these matters.
Yeah.
Yes, I'd like to do that.
Okay.
Sure.
Lucio,
So we
how
have to
did I know
respond
you and
to
I
that.
would get the work?
Yeah. I have also some questions, but it seems to me this is very late out of
That's
the
okay,
time.
go ahead. I gave up my presentation already. Whatever question you have, please let us know.
Yeah. So basically, thank you, Jonathan, of course, for your very insightful, interesting presentation. My point is that, let's say you outline a different society, okay, different world. Now, the point usually in this exercise is not so much how can be different, the varieties of the different society, but the transition time. So the main point where everybody falls down then is, okay, how can we go from here to there? Provided that we agree with your definitions and your proposals. Now, let's focus, for instance, on the question of education and elections. So democracy. Okay, education. How can people be different from what they are when let's say students in economics are told every year in all exams, in all courses, that human beings are selfish, opportunistic, and goal-seeking in terms of maximizing their values. So now what do we expect? That people can behave differently than this way after they have been educated with these ideas, these concepts, what they will do, what they will, as the day that they will become decision makers, so let's say policy makers, or in a company, or even repeating the same stories, the same ideas in the future at school or at university. Yep. And so the question is how to change 99% of courses in economics, because if you go there and propose a different view, they will tell you, okay, but you don't know what economics is. I mean, because economic theory, at least mainstream economic theory, will tell those type of things. So you have to reformulate an entirely new idea and new theory. And how can you go through that way? That's first point. Second point, democracy. No, because it's somehow it's very, there are connections between the two. That is, how can we change society, or how can we expect that society change when the people who mostly suffer from, let's say, Donald Trump's policy, then will vote for Donald Trump. So if we are in the jungles election and the gazelles vote for lions, what can you do? That's the point.
Okay.
If they are so masochist to vote for who is going the worst for them. That's the point, the transition, how to manage the transition from, and there is a problem of circularity, because how, let's look at Russian Revolution, Bolsheviks Revolution, and even Chinese Revolution. So how did they solve the problem? They solved by centralizing everything, creating the parties as avant-garde, and installing a dictatorship. So they said, people cannot do that their own. We are the avant-garde, and so we will do, and we will drive the people to the new society. But we don't want it because we are all for democracy. But this is a circular way. If you are for democracy, then how to manage when gazelles vote for lions?
Yes. Okay, so the two questions, Lucia. So the first question was my little story about the farmer. You remember I said, when you ask him the way, and he says, well, I wouldn't start from here. So the purpose of this was to point out what in cybernetics would look like a good society, what would be meaningful and be anti-authoritarian and stop them. How you get there is another question, and I agree that's
yes. Yes.
And it is, and that is the question of a change manager. It's easy to come up with the plan. How you get there is always the difficulty. So the next question you have, this thing, the constitute. So you were talking about economics and the teaching of economics. So you have to look at why people, and I think this book by Jonathan Roch is really good, because he looks very closely at why do people sell misinformation, or why do they sell the cancel culture? Why do we bully people into certain behaviors? And it comes back again to this social identity theory that people want to be in a group, and they are sometimes. So one of the interesting things about Donald Trump supporters is they have behaved almost exactly as though the theory would say. So they would vote for things that are against them because they want to be in that group, even if that involves them telling. So there's this interesting story, which I think I sent you in an email, it's now called Truthism, but where a Trump supporter was caught lying. He was telling, they said, but this is not true. And his argument was, it could be true. In other words, in my narrative that I have created, it is true. And this was the alternative facts statement that the lady came out with on the news. Now, what is Jonathan Roch says, which is really interesting, is people will tell lies as long as it doesn't affect them in reality, but it affects their belonging to the group. So they're very happy to say the earth is flat and swear blind the earth is flat, because it doesn't make any difference to their lives. When it starts to be things about vaccinations, they start to wobble. And we're already seeing in America, when the real truth starts to hit, they all rush to get vaccinations. So this is where the constitution of knowledge becomes really important. And it's this difference between, so in economics, and this is Kuhn and paradigms, I think. You know, we keep believing things that we want to believe for certain reasons until a paradigm shift comes along and changes it, but we still incorporate the old information in some way into the new paradigm. What Jonathan Roch is saying is that the world has now reached a stage of complexity where large numbers of groups want to sell misinformation or sell outrage to make themselves belong to part of a group, that the truth is getting hidden. And so you need, first and foremost, in economics, in any other science, a means of establishing what, and this was what Morris was talking about when he was talking about critical realism. How do you decide what is true? And one very powerful weapon is that if you have a system that is trusted, so it's the difference between Wikipedia and Facebook. If you have a system that people can go to find what most people believe to be the truth, then you can at least start at a base level. But you will always get groups that perpetuate mistruth or misinformation because it gives them power. Stafford Beer said, he writes a very good children's story called Wizard Poe, which is available. And in it, he has an educator turn up, and he calls the educator a pompous man. And he says to the educator, you could change the world by educating everybody differently tomorrow, but you don't choose to do it. You continue perpetuating all sorts of stuff because it, in many cases, the education system is set up for the educators, not the people to be educated, because there is power in that. It becomes harder for people to do that if there is a constitution of knowledge, if there is somewhere that takes their misinformation and demonstrates it. And this comes back to reputation. You don't want to be an educator who can be subverted by saying something that your students then say isn't true. You need to have power in your reputation, and if you're an educator, you need to have authority, and that authority needs to come from some form of reputation. So that's my arguments in this are not specific. There tend to be heuristics that to get the world out of the mess it's in, we need to have methodologies for constituting knowledge. We need that are accepted worldwide.
All right, if I may answer, this is on it's on behalf of Jason, actually, because I heard something and I think that Jason will agree with me. You were an example, you presented an utopia, like some future society where the problem doesn't exist. And then you say, oh, well, here it is. And now we just have to figure out how to get there. And Lucio actually brought up, and that is an essential component in strategic management research. Actually, you make a plan and then you start implementing it, and the plan completely changes, and it has been all a waste of time. So in other words, that utopian, that is, I think, what I was reacting against, that really it's more about where are we today and how did this problem come into existence. And then we can start figuring out how to change it, because I think lots of people have been struggling with what you just presented. And an example is the 1930s with the Vienna Circle and all the discussions around them. And then you had the Frankfurt School. They were all concerned about truth and authority. And they really did an effort to get to the issue. And so we have already had the discussions about truth and all the varieties and an upside down way of thinking to get away or closer to truth. So it's like, what is it that we have missed? And I think you gave the answer by not saying it. You talked about trust, and trust is an economics thing, like you have a market for trust or you measure trust. And no, sorry, you didn't. You said reputation. You always were saying reputation. But actually, what is the dynamic underlying reputation from the first person? That this, I want to be trusted, and I want to trust someone. And when is the breakdown in the society when trust is being violated? And that is actually what's happening today, that all the relations with all the lying, it becomes much harder to actually trust. And there is something very real that's being destroyed as we speak all over the world. And that, I think, is again cybernetics, like feedback loops. How can this be restored? How can the negativity or whatever it is, how can it be blocked? How can it be turned into something positive? And
Don't go, Carl. Stay with us.
Yes.
Sorry, I gotta go.
So
Yeah,
just
you have
quickly-
a very wonderful comment in the chat box that I have to read for him in his meeting. Carl says, thank you all for the stimulating discussion. My only comment for the moment is that there were many points made here which are far more controversial and biased than the group realizes. I would like to suggest that in the future, the group deal with specific examples from politics and economics rather than abstract generalities. Beware, everyone. So with that, I think it's a good hope for all of us to work on. You agree? Specific examples. Next
I
time.
totally agree.
Pay attention to that. Okay, so we're almost half an hour past our time. Thank you so much for today. Wonderful discussion.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
I